Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining. I hope you enjoy this presentation because I'm going to talk to you about a very interesting saga, Icelandic saga, in the hope that I will convince you to read the whole story. So first of all, I'm going to explain a little bit what legendary sagas are because the whole corpus of Old Norse, Old Icelandic literature can be grouped in several types of sagas. Then I'm going to talk to you about this particular saga, what makes it different and interesting, as well as offer you a very broad summary. And then I am going to refer to the women in the saga because it is also something I've dealt with, a small study I've made for a recent conference I took part in for the University of Liverpool. So without further ado, let me tell you a bit about what legendary sagas are. So if you engage with Old Icelandic literature, you're going to find, first of all, the sagas of the Icelanders. These are sagas that deal with the settlement of Iceland by, well, mostly Norwegians, but also the Celtic element was very much present, as well as people from other regions of Scandinavia. But these are the best known sagas, such as the Saga of Njol or the Saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, and so on and so forth. There is, however, another group of sagas, the so-called legendary sagas, the Fornaldarsögur Norðurlanda, which means the sagas of antiquity. And these do not deal with the settlement of Iceland, but rather with Germanic stories from the continent and from Scandinavia. So stories of the old Germanic past, of the migration period. So stuff happening, generally speaking, between the 5th and the 8th century. So events well before the conversion to Christianity and the settlement of Iceland. The term is actually quite new because it was coined by a scholar, by Carl Christian Ravn, in 1829-30 in his 3-volume edition of these sagas. Legendary sagas are not a well-defined genre. They encompass a variety of texts marked by different styles, but they are bound together by this shared setting of the migration time and of old heroic legend. They often feature journeys and quests, encounters with supernatural beings, bridal quests, battles, and so on. Some scholars have argued that this is indeed a genre, while others maintain that they are best understood as a loose corpus of literature. And there is a very lively debate going on about the precise definition of legendary sagas and which texts should be included in this category at all. They are sometimes divided into several subgenres based on their content and their perceived distance from the native Scandinavian legendary tradition. So, for example, we can have heroic sagas, typically tragic in nature, including stories about heroes such as Sigurd, better known as Siegfried, in the continental legends. The Volsungs, they're the correspondents of the Nibelungs from the continent in Icelandic literature. And so here you can read the Volsunga saga, it is the best known, but also other sagas such as the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, and the saga I will be talking to you about today, which is the saga of King Hrolf Kraki. Other sagas can be considered Viking sagas. They are characterized by their picaresque nature and often feature the exploits of Viking heroes. Such examples include the saga of Arrowod, the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, as well as the saga of Gautrek. And then we have the adventure sagas. They're often more folkloric and romantic in tone, and they involve journeys to fantastical lands and a lot of encounters with supernatural beings. If you want some examples here, you can read Bosa Saga, the saga of Hrolf Gautreksson, or Gongu Hrolf's saga. In terms of origin and development, they are quite obscure. There are relatively few surviving manuscripts of the legendary sagas dating earlier than the 14th century. Most of the oldest manuscripts actually date from the 15th century. However, there are some references that at least some of these sagas may have been written as early as the 13th century. At any rate, it has been argued that the Fornaldarsögur, the legendary sagas, originated in the learned culture of the Middle Ages. So that essentially means that there were writers, there were chroniclers or monks who were very much interested in genealogical stories. They were interested in narratives that sought to explain the origins of people. Then we also have the influence of Eddic poetry, of old Icelandic poetry dealing with mythological topics. For example, the Volsunga saga, that's largely a prose version of the Eddic poems belonging to the Volsunga traditions. Or we also have some poetry that we do not have in other medieval manuscripts, and that poetry can be found in the saga of Hervor and Heiðrek. Scholar Adalheiður Guðmundsdóttir noted that the material of the Volsunga saga, for example, seems to have been particularly widespread and popular, and its dissemination across northern Europe can date as far back as the 7th century. From the 7th to the 10th century, poetry survives, indicating that some of the main characters were well known among the Anglo-Saxons as well, and by the 9th century, the subject matters were very much known in Scandinavia. Now, in 14th century manuscripts, legendary sagas are not really grouped together, but they're largely found in some other contexts, like, for example, in the context of the king's sagas and some other ancient history tales. And scholar Arman Jakobsson suggests that the legendary sagas may have been understood as exactly this, as the ancient history of Scandinavia rather than some distinct literature genre. In order to find out more about these sagas, we need to study the manuscript tradition, because the manuscript tradition provides a lot of insight into their development and their reception. The oldest legendary saga manuscripts are not considered to be original, and the dating of many manuscripts is uncertain, which poses a lot of problems. The earliest extant manuscripts suggest that all these subgenres of legendary sagas were in circulation in the 14th century. The majority are found, like I said, in manuscripts from the 15th century. They engage with the question of truth and fiction in very complex ways because of this problem of manuscript transmission, among others. And it also shows that medieval audiences likely had a broad appreciation of different kinds of sagas. While some of these stories present themselves as history, others embrace fully the fantastical element, the fictional element. And there is also a term very often used in order to classify these stories, and that is Saga, so literally the lying saga, which was used in the Middle Ages for all these kinds of narratives, highlighting the awareness of different categories of truths that were claimed in saga literature. The role of travel is also an important one when studying this kind of literature, because many of these stories feature journeys to fantastical lands, encounters with supernatural beings, and this reflects, well, on the one hand, the importance of travel in Norse culture, but also the broad focus on oral traditions and folklore. So essentially, the authors were trying to combine learned material from medieval Europe with native Norse traditions. So we have heroism and heroic ethos as a main theme. Then we have the nature of leadership and power, the complexities of family, relationships, kinship, also the topic of fate and free will, the relationship between the human and the supernatural, the power of magic and prophecy, exploration of different worlds and cultures, and the construction of identity and community. So, to conclude this first part, so to speak, we can say that this category of stories provide a rich and complex insight into the beliefs, values, and imagination of, first and foremost, of medieval Icelandic society. Yeah, because we're talking here about stories that were written in the high Middle Ages in Iceland. So the way people interacted with the past and recreated it in order to to get across their own ideas about society and about what they perceived as being the distant past. Nevertheless, their heterogeneous nature makes it difficult to define them, and the manuscript tradition suggests that they were a popular form of entertainment and that they would have had different meanings throughout the Middle Ages. And this poses the next question, which is what sources of inspiration did these Icelandic authors use in the Middle Ages? Well, as already stated, some of these sources can be traced back to the older tradition of skaldic poetry and of Eddic poetry. Skaldic poetry was essentially the poetry the court poets were writing, who worked at the court of a king or a chieftain in Scandinavia, and Eddic poetry, that is that poetry which mainly deals with either mythological aspects or cosmological aspects in mythology, as well as with some heroic traditions such as the Volsungs. The Saga of Hervor and Heidrek, on the other hand, preserves some of these poems that are not really found in other medieval manuscripts. And then we have a lot of verses about which we already know from more ancient Skaldic tradition or Eddic tradition that were added to these sagas, which is the reason why some scholars actually use this type of classification in regard to the use of verse in order to group these sagas. So first of all, we have sagas that have stylistic connections to skaldic poetry, and then we have sagas about Norwegian chieftains and farmers, which often have associations with the more commonly known type of sagas, that is the sagas of Icelanders. While the role of oral tradition is acknowledged as a primary source, we also have some other sources for these ancient legends that form the basis of much of these legendary sagas. The formulas and motifs, at least part of them, can be traced directly to oral tales, suggesting that their style is often closer to an oral than a narrative one. Some elements of particular sagas show resemblance to some stories that were circulating at the time or even earlier. So definitely we do have this strong oral tradition even after the writing tradition was adopted once Christianity got well established in Iceland. Short sagas might resemble, in particular, these oral prototypes, and longer, more complex sagas, they were more likely literally constructions because of their tendency to take all these elements and then reframe them and put them together and create a completely different story. At any rate, we are talking about a learned historiography. That is the term researcher Annette Lassen proposes for defining this type of sagas. So essentially, origins intertwined with medieval chronicles, with stories about genealogies. So these stories are trying to explain the origins of peoples, and then combined with verses and mythologies and so on. She also highlights the importance of Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum, that would be a 12th century Danish chronicle, as a potential model for the Icelandic writers, because Gesta Danorum incorporates material very, very similar to that found in the legendary sagas and could have served as a source of inspiration and a model for Icelandic writers seeking to create their own stories, their own origin stories in the vernacular. We also have the Lost Skjoldunga saga as a good example. That is an early example attributed to a bishop, Paul Jonsson of the bishopric of Skalholt in Iceland, which is also one of the main materials or potential materials for the saga of King Hrolf Kraki. And if you read this, let's call it a chronicle, Gesta Danorum, you're going to see that the author doesn't really prioritize realism. He prioritizes the story. So in this sense, there is also an element of entertainment that seems to have been common to both the work of Saxo Grammaticus and most fantastical legendary sagas. Another important source of inspiration would be Frankish and Germanic legends, particularly those connected to the age of migrations. And you can see this influence clearly in the Volsunga saga. The oldest layer here draws on Germanic and the Frankish legends, reflecting connections to a broader Germanic heroic tradition. So these stories would have been very much disseminated across northern Europe. So Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxon England, continental Europe as well. Then other sources we can mention here are, for example, the romance novels, so Arthurian legends. That would be most obvious for the later sagas. There are lots of motifs and themes, there's all elements of folklore that would have circulated not only on the continent, but also they would have definitely reached Scandinavia and Iceland as well, contributing to this great deal of material that we have. So regarding the earliest manuscripts, we have the manuscript Hauksbók as the oldest manuscript containing such a legendary saga, the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. I highly recommend that you read it. It's also very fun to read. It is a story of a shield maiden, at least in the first part of the saga. And here we have a dating to the early 14th century, so that is quite early for this particular type of saga. And then we have another manuscript from the 14th century, notable as the first manuscript to group different legendary sagas together. For example, Osmondar saga Kapabana, Orvar Or saga, and Hrolf saga Gautreksonar. And then we have more and more material. In the 15th century, we have the earliest known manuscripts for the majority of this type of sagas, including the famous examples, Volsunga saga or the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. A lot of manuscripts from the 16th and 17th century, a testament to their increased popularity with the passage of time. So to sum it up, we have the lack of original manuscripts. That is a problem here. We have an uncertainty in manuscript dating, and we also have this problem of how traditional material was reframed and reinterpreted. So at any rate, everything suggests that we are dealing with a process of transmission and adaptation that was very dynamic, that was very fluid, with saga writers drawing and reinterpreting on a wide range of material in order to create their own story, their own unique narratives. After this brief introduction, let's look at the saga of Hrolf Kraki and see what it is and what research has been dealing with so far. So the saga of Hrolf Kraki is generally classified as a legendary saga, although there are some researchers classifying it as a romance. Again, these are the sagas that are set in the ancient times. King Hrolf Kraki would have been a legendary king of Denmark who lived in the 6th century. So this is likely based on earlier sources, including oral traditions, skaldic poetry, and Latin chronicles, such as the aforementioned Gesta Danorum, written by Saxo Grammaticus. The earliest manuscripts date to the beginning of the 14th century. The saga's transmission is complex, with numerous copies and variations existing across different manuscripts. And this suggests that the saga was quite popular and widely circulated throughout the medieval period. The version we have now, however, so the versions actually, because there are multiple versions on which the saga was based in its current translations, that would be a manuscript or several manuscripts from the 17th century. So definitely a later date. And because of that, we should think about the saga as being a sort of combination between some historical core and entertainment ritual and a lot of mythologization and the fantastical, supernatural as well, legend. So definitely quite a large mashup of difficult and different elements, which is why scholar Arman Jakobsson uses the term kolbitur to describe it. So essentially, like one big puzzle that challenges our understanding of the saga material and of the relationship between history and saga material and manuscript transmission. We have some key elements here, thematic elements, such as heroism and loyalty, betrayal, fate, and the episodic structure allows for the inclusion of various adventures and challenges faced by King Hrolf and his champions, his companions. A lot of supernatural elements, fantastical elements, all kinds of references to shape-shifting, for example, battles between wizards or armies of sorcerers and other supernatural beings, and the idea of prophecy and divination also very important here. But then we also have ideas which are rather from this Romance period of the Middle Ages, or the Arthurian period, which is, for example, the bridal quest. That would have been quite a common theme for this type of literature. We do have a couple of verses as well that would suggest some connection to older skaldic poetry, and yeah, it would have offered a little bit of insight into the more historical aspect of it. And there are also quite a lot of original elements that point out to its later date. For example, passages where characters express their emotions or thoughts about a particular event. That's not really characteristic for old Icelandic literature. If you read the classical family sagas, you're going to see that everything is presented in a very neutral way, and the authors are not really that interested in judging the characters, or in presenting them as being these complex beings with a rich emotional life and so on and so forth. They don't focus on that at all. On the contrary, here in the saga of Hrolf Kraki, we do have some elements pointing out to this. We have quite rich dialogues, for example, and also more emotional monologues. I will show you later that it has parallels in other sources, and these are very interesting to see in terms of how these themes and characters circulated into this vast world of Northern Europe, both in pre-Christian and Christian times. Right, so speaking about manuscript transmission, that is something that is worth talking about. So like I said, there is some kind of hint that the saga would have been present in the 14th century. We have this hint from a list of particular sagas belonging to a potentially lost manuscript, but the way that we find it and was translated today is actually based on a manuscript from the 17th century, from manuscripts dating back to very late periods, from 1630, something like that. However, we do have evidence that the story was very, very popular. Over 50 manuscripts containing the saga were identified, and the abundance suggests that the saga enjoyed quite the popularity not only in medieval times but also in post-medieval Iceland, so already in the modern time. While most of these manuscripts were produced in Iceland, we also have copies in Sweden, in Denmark, and in Germany, indicating the high interest in the saga, so beyond Iceland. In the 17th century, the saga has attracted the attention of a lot of antiquarians and historians, particularly in Iceland and Sweden. And we do have some figures associated with scholarly pursuits. The bishops Brynjolfur Sveinsson of Skalholt and Thorlakur Skúlason of Hólar, so the two bishoprics of Iceland, and they are linked to several manuscripts containing this particular sagas. Then we have the Swedish antiquarians as well. They were driven by a sense of national identity, first and foremost, interest in the past. So that is one of the reasons why they kept on looking for sagas that would have dealt with the ancient past in a way or another. the function would have shifted over time, as reflected in different manuscript contexts. So if we were to group these manuscripts, we are going to see several functions here. So first we have the scholarly manuscripts. They often contained only one text, which is the text of this saga, and they treated the saga as a worthy historical source for the ancient past. Then we have the showpiece manuscripts. These were produced by, for wealthy patrons. The elaborate manuscripts presented the saga as chivalric literature, emphasizing entertainment and aesthetic appeal. And we also have plain manuscripts. These contained various sagas and were often produced by individuals with historical interests, and they positioned the saga alongside other sagas, sometimes blurring the lines between history and fiction. And then we also have manuscripts from the 19th century. The literary manuscripts, they often involved collections of sagas, and they mostly treated the saga of Hrolf Kraki as popular entertainment. You can see, if you look at the sagas, you're going to see a lot of stylistic innovations and variations. For example, so some 18th century manuscripts introduced significant stylistic changes, incorporating descriptions of emotions and imagery, detailed imagery, resulting in a style that significantly departed from the more neutral and precise style of the Icelandic family sagas. There are definitely some challenges in studying this transmission as well, because it is difficult to attribute these manuscripts to very specific scribes or historical periods, highlighting the complexity of this line of study. What also remains food for thought and for further academic research would be the relationship to oral tradition. So, in what way the oral and the written versions of the saga of Hrolf Kraki would have functioned. The role of oral storytelling is something that is still being discussed nowadays. So, what is the saga of Hrolf Kraki, and what is the story it tells? Well, the plot mainly deals with an ancient family, the Skjoldungar, or the Skilvings in the Anglo-Saxon sources. The saga is actually grouped in several tales, in several thatir, and there is not such a great internal consistency in these stories. It's very difficult to establish a very concrete narrative continuity between them, and also linguistically and stylistically, everything reveals a later stage of development of the Old Norse language. So, the first chapters establish King Hrolf's lineage, and the saga opens with a power struggle between King Halfdan and his envious brother Frodi over the Danish kingdom. Frodi is driven by jealousy and he murders Halfdan. He seizes control of the Danish territories. And the two young sons of Halfdan, Helgi and Hroar, they are spirited away by their foster father Regin, and they find refuge on an island with a magician called Vivil. Now, Vivil, understanding the gravity of the problem and using his cunning and understanding of omens, he guides the boys in their quest for vengeance. With the support of their sister Signy and her husband, they eventually overthrow Frodi and they reclaim their rightful inheritance. So that would be the story up until let's say chapter 4, and then we have the tale of the two brothers of Hroar and Helgi. Helgi in particular, he is one of the main characters of the saga either way. So Hroar, who is presented as being the less aggressive, the milder, the gentler of the two brothers, he marries the daughter of an English king and settles in Northumberland. And then we have Helgi, who's very much known for being quite violent and aggressive, ambitious, a true warrior. And he remains in Denmark and embarks on a series of ill-fated romantic pursuits. He attempts to force the warrior Queen Olaf into marriage, but suffers humiliation in the process. He seeks revenge because of that. He tricks and rapes the queen, unknowingly fathering a daughter with her by the name of Yrsa. Years later, he encounters Yrsa, unaware of her true origins. He falls in love with her and marries her. So, yeah, essentially, he marries his own daughter. Hruar and Helgi, they also experience a conflict over a ring, over a precious ring, eventually leading to the death of Hruar at the hands of their nephew. Helgi avenges Hroar by brutally punishing Hrok. And then, speaking of revenge, Queen Olaf also plots her revenge against Helgi. After she reveals the incestuous nature of Helgi and Yrsa's marriage, she causes Yrsa to leave Helgi and seek refuge with her mother. Helgi is driven by grief by this whole situation, and he engages as a consequence in a brief liaison with an elven woman, a cursed woman, resulting in the birth of a daughter called Skuld, who eventually is going to kill her own brother, half-brother Hrolf. Helgi does attempt to reconcile with Yrsa, who is now married to the Swedish king Adils, but that ends in tragedy as Adils treacherously ambushes and kills him. The next part of the story involves the rise of Hrolf and his champions, the way he gathers a great retinue and becomes a great hero. So Hrolf, who is the son of his father with his own daughter, which causes him to be this very liminal, problematic figure resulting from an incest, emerges as the central figure destined for greatness. This is not the only case. This happens if you read the saga of the Volsungs. We also have the hero Sinfjotli, who is born out of the union between brother and sister, Sigmund and Signy. So this seems to be quite a common topic for the hero to be in this kind of position, this very special position, as somebody resulting from the breaking of unbreakable taboos. At any rate, the saga shifts focus to the champions of Hrolf, who are actually more important than Hrolf in the whole story. It is a saga that is oriented towards showcasing their extraordinary abilities in battles, highlighting the theme of companionship, brotherhood, loyalty, and so on. We have the Swedish warrior Svipdag, for example, who is a very skilled fighter with a mysterious past, and he joins Hrolf's retinue after facing betrayal from King Adils. And then the narrative introduces the very captivating tale of Bjorn, who is a prince cursed to become a bear whose sons inherit his supernatural strengths and abilities. And among his sons, we have the legendary Bodvar Bjarki, Bodvar Little Bear, who is renowned for his bear-like ferocity as well and his unparalleled fighting prowess. Bodvar Bjarki, accompanied by his brother, who is also cursed, Thorir Houndfoot, they join the court of Hrolf, and Bodvar Bjarki quickly establishes himself as the king's most trusted champion. The court of Hrolf is in a place with a lot of archaeological records. As a matter of fact, the place is called Hreiðgarður. It is Leire nowadays in Denmark, and we do have evidence in the sense that some mead halls were discovered there dating back to the 6th, 7th century, thus reinforcing the idea that the saga did indeed have a historical core, but then again, it was very much embellished. So until the 14th century, it definitely had all these fantastical layers added to it. Hrolf, demonstrating his cunning, outwits his brother-in-law, King Hjorvarth, forcing him into submission, and then the stage is set for a final confrontation as Hrolf, urged by Bodvar, prepares to reclaim his father's inheritance from the treacherous King Adils. He is accompanied by his loyal champions, and they embark on a perilous journey to Uppsala in Sweden, which was Adil's stronghold. Along the way, they also encounter god Odin. He is disguised as a farmer named Hrani. This is something Odin often does in different circumstances, not only in the sagas but also in older mythological poetry. And he uses this mask in order to test Hrolf and his men, influencing their destinies. Upon arriving at Adil's court, Hrolf faces a series of treacherous attacks orchestrated by the Swedish king and also aided by his sorceress wife. Hrolf's champions, they demonstrate remarkable courage and loyalty. They defend the king. And then you have Irsa, who is torn between her love for her son and her loyalty to Adils. She secretly aids Hrolf, providing him with valuable treasures and warning him about Adil's treachery. Then Hrolf, he is fueled by anger and confronts and humiliates Adils, marking a turning point in the conflict. And then the saga reveals the tragic consequences of Hrolf's rejection of Odin's gift of weapons, because whereas they accept the help of Odin at the beginning, eventually they end up rejecting the god and what he had to offer. That's also a little bit of a pro-Christian commentary there. Now, Skuld, so his half sister, in the meantime manipulates Hjorvarth into attacking Hrolf, and the last chapters actually involve this this story, the battle between Hrolf and his sister, his half sister, elven sister Skuld. They are caught off guard during Yule festivities and they face a surprise attack. And there you have, in the last chapters of the saga, a very lengthy description about how Skuld gathers this army of sorcerers and Norns and elves and whatever else she came across, all these supernatural beings. And they organize this attack. She also has a black tent, and she definitely has a great deal of magical power. However, Hrolf has his champions, and he tries to use them to their favor. Hjalti, he is one of his most trusted warriors. He rallies the king's men, urging them to fight for their leader. And then we have this epic clash between the champions and their enemies, highlighting their individual skills and prowess and unwavering loyalty, and so on. Bodvar Bjarki's role in this fight is also extremely interesting because he is initially absent from the battle. He enters the fray in a berserker rage. His ferocity is unmatched, and he is actually fighting in the shape of a bear. So his human body sleeps while he fights in the shape of a bear. Then, nevertheless, the narrative shifts to a somber tone as Hrolf and his champions, despite all their very brave efforts, they succumb to Skuld's powerful sorcery and the overwhelming number of their foes. We also have here very well represented the myth of the undead army, because Skuld is a powerful witch who revives the fallen warriors in battle. So this obviously cannot end well for Hrolf, so they eventually lose, and the saga concludes with a brief account of Skuld's short-lived reign of terror and her eventual downfall at the hands of Hrolf's avenging allies. So as you can see from this very brief summary, we do have a lot of sources here emphasizing the richness, the cultural richness of the saga, drawing connections to other important tales such as Beowulf and the lost Skjolnunga saga, definitely incorporating all kinds of myths from ancient Germanic heroic lore, including references to Odin, to the Valkyrie, as well as a lot of themes found in folk tales and legends. So this all creates a very complex and multi-layered narrative that would have resonated even with a medieval audience. Speaking of parallels, let's have a look at these, because I already mentioned Beowulf and the Schildingar, but there are also other interesting stories to explore here. Short version of the story you can also find in the so-called Ingliga saga. That would be the first story from the collection Heimskringla, the history of the kings of Norway, written by Snorri Sturluson. You have some common elements here in the sense that you have the same characters. You have Helgi and Adils and Queen Olof, as well as Irsa. However, the Saga only tells us that Hrolf organized an expedition in Sweden to take revenge, but we don't have much detail about that. It's also stated that he died in his seat in Leire, and one important difference would be that Helgi actually takes Irsa from Adils, and not the other way around as it was presented in the saga, when Irsa goes to Adils after finding out that she married her own father. Some brief references can also be found in mythological poems, such as the Song of the Mill, the Grottasonger. Grotti is the name of a magic mill, and yeah, generally speaking, the story told here is about King Frodi, who employs two slave women who are actually two very powerful giantesses, and he forces them into grinding this magic mill that would bring a lot of richness and wealth and prosperity to his kingdom. But these giantesses end up summoning a great army against King Frodi. So we do have a reference here to Halfdan's son who will kill Frodi, but there seems to have been some kind of conflation here between Hrolf and his father Helgi. The most important parallel is to be found in the poem Beowulf, where we have similar names. Actually, we have the same names, the cognates of the Old Norse names in Old English. This we can find in the composition of the Schildingar dynasty. Here you can find Helfdin, which would be Halfdan, and he has three sons, Hroðgar, Hroðgar would be Hroar in Old Norse, and Halga, who would be Helgi in Old Norse. However, Helgi and Hrolf don't seem to play a very important role here. Hroðgar's hall is the one invaded by the monster Grendel, and the one slaying him is Beowulf, who indeed may be the same character as Bodvar Bjarki from the saga of Hrolf Kraki. And given the name itself, meaning Beowulf, this has been interpreted as a poetic, a metaphorical name for a bear. So the wolf that attacks the beehives would be a bear. So this is very interesting to notice. Well, yeah. So Rolf doesn't really seem to have a central role here, and alongside other differences we can find in the narrative, this would suggest that whereas we do have a broad agreement of all these names, relations, and scenes, we also have these divergences that are expected. Where stories circulate over such a large geographical space, and also over such a broad timeline. So definitely the story was well known, and it passed from one author to another, and took different shapes. Saxo Grammaticus, we have quite a similar story here. The names are slightly different. We don't have Olof, but we have Thora. So Helgi has a relationship with Thora, and the result of that would be Ursa. So Irsa, the daughter, who is again, as in the story of Hrolf Kraki, is tricked by her mother into having commencing a romance with her own father, and the product of that is Rolvo. So Saxo Grammaticus, writing in Latin, definitely Latinized all these Germanic names, yeah. So then he tells us that Rolvo visits them in Sweden, and he boasts of his great physical endurance, and he is made to prove it by standing very close to a large open fire, for example. Yeah, so when he visits King Athislus, that will be Adils, so Ursa's next husband. Another common element would be that he manages to steal a lot of the treasure from Adils, and then, as in the Icelandic saga, King Adils is shown to stop his pursuit of Rolvo or Hrolf in order to pick up some treasure that the hero dropped. So that's also to show that this king was very greedy, and he did not deserve to prevail. Other common elements include the champions Bjarko and Hjalto in their Latinized names here, as well as Hjarvartus, who would be Hjarvard, the husband of Skulda, so Skuld, his half sister, and again this theme of organizing, leading a coup against Rolvo, at the start of which one of the heroes, Hjalto, is entangled with his lover. Speaking of which, there is this kind of bizarre episode at the beginning of the battle where the men of Hrolf don't seem to care much about the battle, but they are engaged in amorous relationships and so on. But then the one who realizes that this was also a trick, and they have to leave their women alone and go to fight because they were warriors. And Hjalto is the one who realizes that, and he urges them to go to battle. The same ending of the plot here. They lose the battle, and Rolvo and almost all of his warriors die. So as you can see here, Saxo definitely knew this story as well, but yeah, he told it in his own particular way. If we go back to Iceland, you're also going to find some references in other sagas. The saga of Cormac the Skald, for example. Here you can find a reference to the sword of Hrolf, to Skofnung, the magical sword, and it is said that this warrior poet borrowed the sword, and he wanted to use it for a duel, but he did not respect its instructions. And apparently, this magic sword had very concrete instructions if you wanted it to work in your favor, because it had some kind of magical snake and that lived inside of it, and you were supposed to care about the snake in a particular way, in an elaborate manner, in order to determine the sword to act in your favor. But Cormac disregards these instructions, and he essentially negates the sword's specific magical powers. And then you also have a reference in the saga of the people of Laxardal, Laxdöla Saga, where the sword again appears as an important heirloom of the powerful Thorkel in the saga's latest chapters. So as you can see from all this material I try to summarize here, there are a lot of connections between these different stories, which again shows us that the material of the saga was very well known, and it was constantly reframed in a very lively and dynamic matter. So what we can remember from this whole story is that the saga has roots indeed in some earlier sources, many of them Latin, as we have seen with the example of Saxo Grammaticus. It might in all likelihood date from the 14th century, but the surviving manuscripts are much later, and it combines all these disparate elements. So the skaldic poetry, the heroic lays, the ancient heroic Germanic literature, as well as some chivalric literature, Arthurian legends, and so on. However, it is still considered a legendary saga, so a saga of the ancient times. And as a matter of the important episodes in the saga, you can recall here the episode about the parents of Helgi, the story of Helgi and Olaf. That's very important here, as well as this idea that the main characters of the story actually revolve around Hrolf, which makes him not so much the central character of the story, but he is the center in the sense that the champions gathered around him are the ones with the more interesting stories. And the third aspect would be that Hrolf himself is part of a much older core of stories that also existed in more ancient times, and there is a definite parallel to the story of Beowulf. If you look a little bit at the pagan and Christian elements present in the saga, that's also something to reflect on. You're going to see that the attitude of the author is somewhat ambivalent, because well, at some point um, he says that the failure of Hrolf was due to the fact that he was not yet Christian. He scolds him for his lack of faith. And on the other hand, we do have the idea of Valhalla as well, but not coming from King Hrolf, coming from one of his champions, who Hjalti again, who says that it doesn't matter if they die, because they were definitely going to be guests in Odin's hall in Valhalla after their death. So this evidently points out to a more ancient core of beliefs here. However, generally speaking, the attitude of the author is definitely one of trying to show that these people were not really pagan, but that they were rather godless, that they relied not on gods but on themselves, and that part of their failure was due to the fact that they were not aware of the true god. And at one point, King Hrolf even calls Odin, so the chief of the Norse gods, he calls him an evil spirit. So that shows a little bit the attitude of the author related to religion and to ancient beliefs. If we were to summarize, we can say that we are dealing with a complex tapestry of influences here, as already explained, but we also have an exploration of human nature. So yeah, sure, we have epic battles, we have supernatural encounters, a lot of fantastical elements. However, we do have some more general themes in the story, and I think it is precisely because these themes were more general that they were attractive to a very different audience, the medieval and post-medieval audience, because we are dealing with betrayal and loyalty and ambition and the enduring power of fate, and also with an exploration of what it is to be a good king. We do have an exploration of royal ideology as well. The saga also functions very well as a window into the past, but not in the sense to discover the past, to use it as a historical source, but it offers an insight into the social and cultural values of medieval Iceland. So again, a world where honor, courage, and loyalty were paramount, but in a different manner than they would have been in pre-Christian Scandinavia. At any rate, there is a common thread, we can say. I think the exploration of royal ideology is very important here, because Hrolf is depicted from the very beginning as this very great king, from the point of view of his knights, of his champions. So if you look at the way King Adils of Sweden, for example, is portrayed, you're going to see that he has a different appearance. He has a golden throne, and then you have Hrolf and Helgi, who also have these special objects like a ring or something like that. But then you also have differences, like for example, there is a great insistence on the gaze of these characters, Hrolf and Helgi, as well as on their character as being sportsmen and being particularly strong and being particularly ambitious and enduring. And yeah, Adils is portrayed with a rather, let's say, inferior point of view. At any rate, there is this parallel between all these characters. Everything tends to suggest that Hrolf in particular, but also his father, were meant to be kings. Um, then yeah, you have the role of the king in the community highlighted. For example, the fact that Frodi forces the population to swear oaths and pay taxes. This would have been as seen as a negative example, because the role was that of justice and protection, and that is exactly what Hrolf does. He makes arbitration, for example, whenever there is a conflict at court. He arbitrates between Svittak and the berserkers who attack him, for example. He scolds his men when they attack people they shouldn't. He resolves crisis. So he's definitely portrayed as a very good leader. He forges a brotherhood, and these virtues such as fidelity and generosity, humility and justice, these would have been virtues not only of ancient Germanic kings, but they would have been virtues that would have definitely appealed to the medieval audience as well. So in this sense, King Hrolf is portrayed as this noble heathen character whose men do not practice pagan customs, and their only fault would have been that they did not know the Christian God. But all things considered, definitely the hero is presented in a very positive manner. Moving on to the last part of this presentation, the women's image in the saga and their contribution to the mental universe. Now, the women, especially in the legendary sagas, are not really part of monographies about images of Viking women, and that may be due to their appearance as stock characters, so characters with no complexity, that can be classified easily, that have no depth of character, and cannot enrich our idea about women in medieval Scandinavia. However, if we analyze the women in the saga, we can nevertheless find some layers of agency and ways in which they influence the narrative as well. We do have a lot of roles attributed to these women. We have the seeress, we have the sorceress, we have the maiden king, we have the farm girl, and we also have the stepmother. We find all these characters in the sagas. So the question that arises is whether these women had some kind of agency of their own, or whether they were sacrificed at the expense of this kind of like homosocial fantasy. We have this brotherhood of champions, which is the main character of the saga, if you will. So this would be a question for us, because there are parts of the saga that are distinctly misogynistic in tone. Some female monsters, for example, are tortured and mutilated, and we also have the behavior of some of the characters. Hjalti, for example, he calls his mistress a whore after asking her whom she would prefer, whether two 22-year-olds to one 80-year-old man. And when she says, well, unexpectedly, when she decides that yeah, she would actually prefer to 22-year-olds, then Hjalti acts very aggressively towards her and bites off her nose. So this is a very weird story from the point of view of a modern audience, but this is also used to show that women were supposed to act in a particular way, and that their behavior was judged quite easily. Skip this. Right. Yeah. So, how do you analyze agency in such a story? Well, agency is not only the idea that you can act in a very active way to determine your role in society. It is more than the opposite of determinism, and it is not reductible to the voluntarism of the sovereign agent. So, this means that agency is rather inside the social context. So, in to what extent can you exert that agency? So, it's not really an abstract set of capacities and potential, because this ability to act is always determined and mediated by dominant norms and relations of powers. So some individuals, in this sense, have more agency than others. This means that the concept itself is inseparable from the concept of power. So it has this additional meaning that you really need to contextualize it in order to establish that a character was able to perform or not. So let's look at a couple of these characters and see whether they could indeed be considered active or not. We have at the beginning of the saga a very interesting character. She is called Heith, and she is a prophetess. She has prophetic abilities. And it is told that she is a wandering character, so she goes from one farm to another, asking people whether they needed her help. And she hears that. King Frodi was looking for his nephews, and he wanted to kill them. And yeah, she offers her help in finding these children, and she does that in order to increase her own status. So, in the sense, the motivation for her taking up this job, in the sense, we can say that she does indeed have some form of agency. And she does maintain her power through complex and cryptic speech, because she utters the prophecies, and people pay attention to her, and people take into account what she has to say. And this is revealed at the beginning of the saga, even by King Frodi himself, because it is stated that King Frodi asked her to use her skills to see where she could tell what she could tell about the young men. He then held a grand feast in her honor and placed her on a high platform used for seidr, that would be a type of Old Norse magic divination. The king then asked what news she could see, for I know, he said, that now many things will come before you, and I see great fortune in you. So definitely this whole idea of preparing a feast for her and the set of compliments suggests that she did have indeed a particular position of power, or at least in this kind of society that was presented here. She's also questioned and threatened by King Frodi because she seemed to have had a corruptible nature. The sister of these two children manages to offer him some payment in order to avoid revealing the fate of the children, and then King Frodi, I quote here, now presses the seeress hard and demands that she tell the truth, or else she will be tortured. She gaped wide, and the telling of magic, so the seidr, became difficult, and then she recited a verse. So in this reaction, we can also see a suggestion that her power is actually quite threatening to the people here at court. Queen Olaf. Now, the role of royal and aristocratic women in the legendary sagas is to give socially cohesive advice, usually. However, Queen Olaf here is in a position of authority, although she doesn't really fight. So she doesn't actually fight, but she does have a seat of power. And Unfortunately, both Olof and Grimhild of Volsunga Saga are depicted as cruel, vicious, and scheming. So we do have author bias here as well as some similarities with other characters. For example, from the Ynglinga Saga, a character called Åsa, said to have caused the death of her husband and brother. Usually, such characters are depicted as quite demonized. Sometimes this has a political component. Queen Gunhildr, the wife of Eric Bloodaxe, for example, she is presented as being very aggressive and also a sorceress. And yeah, well, this is very much in line with this attempt of men to control women. The Maiden King feels threatened, as a matter of fact, but she reacts to this threat of being submitted to the will of a man. She strategically organizes a feast, and um, she reacts to this idea of violently to this idea of becoming someone's wife, in our case Helge's wife, and she wants to remain financially independent. And in a very funny episode in the saga, she completely rejects Helgi, and she manages to orchestrate his emasculation because Helgi is shaved and put in a bag and sent back to his men. So you can imagine the degree of male anxiety such an episode would have caused, which is why the author chose to describe her as the most avaricious of women, Ovsi och Ojavnader. King Helgi is depicted then as being, well, this man who is in need to reinforce his power, which is why he lures her into a forest and promises a lot of treasures to her, and then he ends up abducting her and raping her. So this is his way of stripping her of her individuality, of her power, and it is a reaffirmation of patriarchal misogyny. Another important character in the story is Skuld, so the half sister of Hrolf, who eventually defeats him. Magic in sagas in general, in old Icelandic literature in general, is one of the few areas of empowerment for women, and she is actually depicted as the as possessing the greatest magical powers in Mesta Galdrakin, described in the story, and this has to do with her origin as well, because she is an ambiguous figure. She is the daughter of Helgi, who is human, but then she was also the daughter of an elven woman. So this puts her from the very beginning in this position of a character who is liminal, ambiguous position. She is othered in other words, and this implies the um, um, the attempt at somehow destroying the social order, because she is presented as this character who does not want to accept the order of King Hrolf Kraki and his men. She challenges his power. So, in the sense, we can consider her portrayed in quite a negative manner by the author, and yeah, she conjures this whole army of monsters in her attempt to do so, which is more or less a narrative device with an antiquarian effect in line with the use in medieval romances. So magic is the main way to maintain honor when there is no male in the household to represent you. And Skuld's transgression, in from this point of view, is even more serious because she does have a man in her household. She was the wife of Hjorvard. So, from this point of view, we see that she challenges her own gender or the expectations of her gender by acting on her own behalf instead of using more traditional methods. So this underlying idea remains, the woman's desire to be able to affect her own destiny, but also the destiny of others. And yeah, that's why again the author chooses to condemn sorcery as empowerment, and he manages let's say, preserve the status quo of these gender roles by using characters like Bodvar Bjarki, who attempts to fight quite violently against her army. She's not the only sorceress in the story. We also have Wheat here, who is actually responsible for the fate of Bjorn and his children. Um, she is of Finnic origins, and this casts her as well at the margin of society. And she is known in the story for having attempted to have a relationship with her own stepson. So this again points to the male anxieties that are expressed in the sagas, in the sense that transgression, sexual transgression, is displayed in the form of attempted adultery and the subsequent curse, which shows us that the expectation, the role expectation at the time, would have been of fidelity, and this would have been very well known from the more chivalric sagas, such as the story of Tristan and Isolde. However, this is one character who breaches the passivity and who attempts to own her own actions. She transfers her rejection onto Bjorn and his offspring, who become outsiders following her curse. And in accordance with the stock image such characters have, she is villainized by being presented as a very wild sexual being, a predatory being. She is described as a troll, suggesting a very monstrous being. Magic, nevertheless, is used from her point of view as an attempt to save her own honor, but it is interpreted as chaos and destruction. So we have, for example, here a line spoken by Bjorn, who is very angry at his father, and he asks him, "Are you so ensnared by this monster that you can hardly keep your wits or your rightful kingship?" So again, the violent reaction of masculinity at female transgressions. Two more characters who are definitely much less active than the previous ones. The first is Irsa. Irsa is presented as a character having very limited agency. She is just a pawn in her mother's vengeance, and she remains loyal to her son by Helgi. um, in in Saxo Grammaticus, she does seem to have a little more agency than in this saga, because she has knowledge of the incest, and she so Queen Olaf sends the daughter to him and instructs her to seduce her father, which makes the author to be more directly judgmental, as in presenting this shameful thing both women had done. But all in all, in the saga, she is this very submissive character, and she's emblematic for the societal constraints of women. She does have one attempt at freedom, so to speak, when choosing to stay with King Adils of Sweden, and when she eventually rejects her father/husband Helgi. But all in all, the topic of agency is here a dim one, or at least comparison to the other sorceresses characters. The last female character relevant for us is Bera. Bera would be the wife of Bjorn and the mother of the hero Bodvar Bjarki. She is also a character that, quite well conforms to the expectations, those being loyalty and motherhood. However, if you look more carefully to her story, we can catch a glimpse of subtle forms of empowerment, because despite Bjorn essentially turning into a monster, he turns into a bear, she still continues the relationship. And she does have an active form of motherhood, in that she shares this knowledge about magic and shape-shifting and so on, about the children's heritage, that they were cursed by this evil sorceress who was rejected by Bjorn, and she tells them about the wrongdoings in the family, and in this way, by sharing this knowledge, the storytelling, and so on, in this way, we can say that she also had some kind of agency. On the other hand, her role is very much limited to this domestic sphere, and her sacrifice and suffering reinforce the social patterns. So, what I concluded from this short study of these women in the saga of Hrolf Kraki is that we're actually dealing with a series of transgressions, especially in the use of magic and sexuality in the story. And these are meant to offer women temporary power. However, there is a difference between power and authority. Authority is not really that well represented here. We are rather dealing with attempts at some kind of individuality, or at least attempts at trying to determine your own fate. But we don't really have this whole idea of authority that is, well, in essence, decision making and the ability to transform those decisions into act. These transgressions are determined by inequalities. So, like I said, magic, for example, this would be the best example. In order for women to attempt at a higher status in society, and this definitely causes a lot of anxieties on the part of male-dominated structures. Overall, however, the story presents a power dynamics that reinforces patriarchal models, such as limited decision making and the fear of undermining expectations, as well as a general disdain and condemnation of magic and sorcery in the story. And women, despite their limited agency, they help in quite a definitive manner the story, because let's not forget that they engender both the heroes and the villains. So Hrolf and Skuld. So from that point of view, they do have complex contributions to the narrative, and there are also quite a lot of women characters with a lot of roles, which is not something that you see very often in this kind of literature. So that was from these points of view. I would say that the women in the saga play quite an essential role in the general development of the plot. And so a further conclusion about the saga of Hrolf Kraki from this gender perspective. Well, we do have here a reflection of the social political realities of the High Middle Ages in Iceland, and we have some sort of scale of transgression, as we've seen in the case of Bera. That would be one extreme of the scale, up until the rebellion of Skuld. That will be the second extreme of the scale. So we have this transgression, graded scale from compliance to utter rebellion in fantasies where of female power, where norms are subverted. So the author definitely played with the different roles females had in the story, and he tried to show the dynamics between male and female gender roles by creating such characters that would have been indeed very unrealistic for the time we're discussing, so 15th century, 14th, 15th century. But that is the advantage of such legendary and more folkloristic tales, because you're able to deal with taboo elements, transgressions, and generally speaking very difficult topics, because you are framing them in stories that are not really placed in your time. So that makes it a little easier to talk about them, to challenge them, and to offer new explanatory models. And this functions very well in relation to the male characters, who are always presented as having this kind of brotherhood, this homosocial bonding. So overall, the women do share this attempt at an autonomous space, even though that space is ultimately defeated in its purpose. Well, I hope I managed to spark off your interest regarding the saga from different perspectives. You can find them. You can find it in two translations. First, we have the translation of Jesse Bayek from Penguin Classics, and then you have a newer translation from Jackson Crawford alongside the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. So I highly recommend that you read it, because, like I said, it is very complex. It is very entertaining, and it deals with a lot of topics, especially this very complicated and dynamic connection between myth and legend and history, and all these aspects regarding how people in medieval Iceland would have dealt with the ancient past. The inspiration is a very real one. So you have the site at Lejre in Denmark, which is very close to Copenhagen and to Roskilde. In Roskilde, you could also visit the Viking Ship Museum, which is absolutely extraordinary. So in Lejre, now you have this giant park where you can visit a reconstruction of a great mead hall alongside reconstructions of several longhouses and workshops, and also a think gathering. And not only Viking stuff, there is also a Neolithic village there, as well as some traditional houses from the 18th and 19th century. So definitely a place I highly recommend you to visit if you ever get to Denmark. And if you go a little further away from this complex, which is a modern one, you're also going to find the remains, or the when I say remains, I actually mean the imprints in the ground of several halls, actually dating back to the late Iron Age. So that would be the 6th, 7th century. And you're also going to find some ship settings quite nearby. So ship settings were one of the many possibilities you had in the late Iron Age to have a burial, or at any rate, it was a ritualized site of burial, and it tells us a lot about representations of the afterlife. And near this ship setting, near the stone ships, you can also visit a small museum. And at this museum, you're going to find probably one of the most interesting objects ever discovered from the Viking Age, which is the Odin of Lejre, or Odin. Let's say Odin, although it is not really that clear whether it is Odin or not. I suspect it really was, but with these figurines, we cannot possibly tell for sure what they represent. But at any rate, it's a very small figurine where you have this representation of a seated person, and this person appears to have all kinds of animals surrounding it, such as the wolves and ravens. So that would suggest that it was indeed Odin enthroned, and one of the eyes is also scratched. So very compelling representation of Odin. The other interpretation would have been that it was a prophetess or a vulva, but I think that there are more arguments to suggest that it was Odin indeed. So a very rich area from a historical perspective, and also from a mythological perspective. From that point of view, the saga of Hrolf Kraki remains extremely important for us, because it has this whole core of elements that you can find in many other sources, such as Beowulf and Saxo Grammaticus and so on. But it also shows at the same time how embellished it was, and how dynamic this whole process worked, where multiple layers were added with the passage of time, and the end product is this very fantastical, magical, entertaining story that captured the attention of scholars up until the modern and contemporary period. Thank you so much, and I hope you will follow my YouTube channel as well, because there you're going to find many more similar topics and lectures, and I hope you will check some of them out.